Welcome to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. Over the next half an hour, we'll be looking beyond the business headlines by giving you in-depth perspective on the stories that are affecting all of us. Coming up on today's show, it's a new dawn for global politics. Joe Biden has been sworn in as the 46th president of the world's largest, arguably the most important economy. I'll be discussing what next for the United States of America with Assistant District Attorney Pamela Ibe, who'll be joining us from Texas. And I'll be speaking with the founding partner of investment firm Brigg McAdam and a spokesperson of Republicans overseas, Greg Swenson. Later on in the show, I'll be discussing the next phase of the UK vaccine rollout with a professor at the Open University, David Mao, and I'll be joined by the Conservative Party's London mayoral candidate, Sean Bailey. He'll be telling us why it's imperative that black and minority ethnic communities take up the offer to be vaccinated, should they be asked. But first, let's start the programme with news from here in the UK. Earlier this week, the official death toll from COVID-19 in Britain hit 93,290, the highest in Europe and the fifth worst in the world, after America, Brazil, India and Mexico. Almost 40,000 COVID-19 patients are being treated in British hospitals today. On Wednesday, the daily death toll was a record 1,820, prompting this response from the Prime Minister.
Well, it's an absolute. These figures are appalling, and of course we think of the suffering that each one of those deaths represents to their family, to their friends, and I've got to tell you, Sam, there will be more to come, because what we're seeing is the result of the wave of the new variant that we saw, I think, just before Christmas. I think it was on the 18th of December or thereabouts that we saw it coming through, and it really has been a very big peak of infection. It spread very quickly, not just in London and the southeast where it began, but now in virtually all parts of the country.
Well, for more on this, I'm now being joined by our business correspondent, Simon Pusey. Simon, the COVID UK story is a tale of two halves, isn't it? On the one hand, really doing well with the inoculation. On the other hand, some more record-breaking death tolls.
Yeah, you're right. Let's start with the good news first, and that is those vaccination figures, which the government are trumpeting as loud as they can, because they do, on the surface, look very good compared to other European countries. That isn't entirely accurate, based on the fact that other countries are often giving 2 doses, and they're not calling it, single doses. They're saving the doses to do 2 doses, which gives you obviously bigger inocularity, whereas the UK government have decided we're going to try and give as many people the vaccine as possible in the first go and then get them back in a couple of weeks later for the second. So the good news is that another 65 vaccination centres have opened today, and the Health Secretary Matt Hancock says the UK is giving 200 vaccinations per minute on average. He also says they've given over 5 million doses to 4.6 million people. That's about a third of people over 80, and so it does seem to be going very smoothly, or more smoothly maybe than we were anticipating. But as you say, the deaths do keep on rising, and there are some horrible numbers coming out, much more significant really in terms of volume than they were in the first lockdown. 1,820 just a day ago, that's up from 1,610, and these are huge numbers, and it's really hard to visualize those numbers. The good news is the cases are dropping. It looks like the current lockdown is having a good effect. A day ago, 33,000 positive cases. That was the lowest number of cases since the 27th of December, about a month ago. So that is working, and usually what happens when the cases go down is obviously the deaths go down. But at the moment, we're just seeing from the backlog of 2 weeks ago, usually, which is there or thereabouts the time you need to give it, that the deaths are still rising, and it's such a sad thing to see. I say the effect this has on people, obviously not just on the health terms and the mental terms, but also things like the economy and business. Nearly 9 million people have had to borrow more money because of the impact of the coronavirus and the lockdowns. Glastonbury Festival, I know this is a minor thing, but again, this is what people look forward to, especially younger people in the summer.
Cultural event in Britain.
That's been cancelled, and that has a lot of economic effects as well. And it really is, that's a huge beast. But the whole music and sort of cultural industry is really struggling at the moment, because obviously that relies on people and people in a closed space. I'd say that the one light on the end of the tunnel is tens of thousands of businesses will be able to receive insurance payouts. That's after a Supreme Court ruling found largely in favour of small firms being able to claim on the first lockdown. So there's lots and lots of bleak news, especially with those deaths. But there is some light at the end of the tunnel with the vaccinations and with the number of cases dropping. It looks like lockdown is working.
Thank you, Simon. Later on in the show, we'll return to our discussion on the UK vaccine rollout. But for now, this moment.
Please raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., do solemnly swear.
I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., do solemnly swear.
That I will faithfully execute.
That I will faithfully execute.
The office of President of the United States.
Office of President of the United States.
And will, to the best of my ability.
Will, to the best of my ability.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
The Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
Congratulations to him indeed. But how quickly can America emerge from the political turmoil that has dominated Washington for the past few weeks? Let's ask Assistant District Attorney Pamela Ibe, who joins me now from Kuntz in Texas. Pamela Ibe, thank you so much for joining me on Channel's Business Global. I was just reminding our viewers, if they needed reminding, about that pretty historic, monumental swearing-in ceremony. You're obviously on the ground, though I know you're pretty far away from Washington. But can you just sum up the sentiment? You're in Texas. I know it's a red state. There are 74 million Trump supporters that may not have been happy. But just explain to us what's happening in your reaction.
Thanks, Juliana. Thanks for having me. Well, yesterday was monumental, like you said, for so many reasons. And the feeling on the ground was various in emotions. There was relief, for one thing, that nothing happened. And there was also a sense of a welcoming of normal leadership. The norms were restored. And even though there were a lot of people that wished for a different president, the majority of people just want to look forward. And so, and I'm in a red state, like you said, the majority here, especially in the rural areas where I practice, most of them wanted a different president. But the people that wanted to overturn the wish of the people, those are not the majority.
Absolutely. I've got to ask about the first 100 days. A lot of people are talking about that. That's obviously always a political milestone wherever you are across the world. But Biden has got a particularly difficult task because, look, I'm in London. This show is going out in Nigeria and across the world. You're in the US. Everybody across the world is expecting a lot from him. But there are concerns that this second impeachment trial that some Democrats are pushing is going to overshadow that. Do you suspect that Biden and Harris might be a little bit concerned about pushing for this? Because, we've said goodbye to Trump, but Trump could dominate their first 100 days in office because of this issue.
And you're right. There was some concern about that, even from Biden himself, not wanting to go back to rehashing things. But the enormity of what happened on January the 6th has kind of overshadowed that. The current sense is they can do both. They are being called upon to multitask. And even the Congress and the Senate, most of them are agreed on the fact that they can do both. Like Senator put it, most Americans juggle many things in one day, so they can multitask. And some put it more funnily, that they can walk and chew gum at the same time.
Pamela Ibe, an Assistant District Attorney. You're coming to us from Texas. Thank you so much for joining me on Channel's Business Globe, and I look forward to connecting with you again. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Let's turn now to a view from the opposition. Many in the Republican Party were appalled by the incitement of insurrection at the Capitol Hill on January the 6th, yet a handful of them did stand by the former president until the bitter end. Some say it was a relationship of fear over admiration. However, there's no denying that Trump's legacy will haunt the party for years to come. Well, for more on this, I'm now being joined by Greg Swenson, a founding partner at investment firm Brigg McAdam and a spokesperson for Republicans overseas. Greg Swenson, thanks so much for joining me on the show. I won't mince my words. I'll get straight to the point. It's been a political disaster, hasn't it, really, for the Republican Party over the past couple of weeks. How quickly do you think that they can emerge from this?
I'm not sure about the timing, but they definitely will emerge, Juliana. And I think, you're absolutely right. It was a political disaster, more so for President Trump than the party in general, in terms of the riots and the mob activity at the Capitol. But for the party, the Georgia special election, or the Georgia Senate runoff election, was a complete disaster. It was a race that the Republicans easily could have won, and the polls were indicating that in early December. But partly because of the president essentially ignoring the race. That was a race that they could have won and they lost. And that was truly a disaster for the party, and more importantly, a disaster for the country.
Absolutely. Trump, of course, never one to leave a stage quietly, said that he will return someday. He's likely to. Why not? He's got 74 million that wanted him to be president. But what happens to that loyal fan base? Clearly, not everybody was happy with the insurrection. I think it would be foolish, which I know some media outlets are doing, in trying to claim that all Trump supporters respected that. They clearly didn't. But genuinely, what does happen to that base? I'm sure there are some, senior Republican leaders that are pretty much afraid to tie themselves with them, but they need their support.
Yeah, to a certain degree. But, I think there's a few moving parts here. One is that, the mob violence was universally condemned by the party and by all Americans. So that, I think it's pretty easy to segregate that very small group. Even President Biden, I thought, had a great comment on that evening, that this was a small mob of extremists, and it doesn't reflect America, nor does it reflect Republicans in general. So if you could just segregate that very small extreme group from the rest of the party, that's easy.
Just very briefly, Greg, how do you think those 100 days are going to be like for Biden? Of course, there are some Democrats that are screaming for this impeachment trial, a second impeachment trial, to be sped up. Do you think if that does happen, it's going to take away the shine for some of those changes that Biden is hoping to make?
I think they will. And I think that's a disservice to President Biden, who, and in many ways, from a purely partisan perspective, what they've done in the last 2 weeks has actually helped Trump, or helped his reputation, believe it or not, by being really outrageous and vindictive in terms of how they're treating not President Trump, but how they're treating Trump voters and Trump supporters. Remember, 74 million people did vote for him. So I think it's an opportunity for Biden to show some leadership, because one of the concerns going into the election was that Biden would be pressured or pushed around by the progressive left wing of the party. So far, it looks like he's basically serving them more than he's serving his own interests as more of a centrist. So I hope that he pushes back a little bit. So far, I'm not seeing that. He hasn't really pushed back against impeachment. That's not really indicating that he's going to control the party from the center. And then some of his executive actions already, for example, shutting down the Keystone Pipeline, that doesn't connect with voters. This is economic destruction. And that's what I think many voters, especially Republicans, are afraid of, given, the real economic gains that were made over the last 4 years by everybody in America, including minority groups that typically vote Democrat. And that's why, the president and the Republicans did very well with different ethnic groups and minority groups in the country. So I hope that he takes advantage of that and maintains some of this, economic expansion. But so far, what I'm seeing is a real tilt to the far left of the party, and that's just going to leave economic destruction, which is a shame.
Absolutely. Well, it's all to watch. We're all eyes are on Washington, and I think it's going to be that way for the next 100 days at the very least. Greg Swenson, founding partner at Brigg McAdam, thank you so much for joining me on the show. Coming up on Channel's Business Global, I'll be discussing the next phase of the UK vaccine rollout with immunology expert at the Open University, Professor David Mail, and I'll be joined by the Conservative Party's London mayoral candidate, Sean Bailey. See you after the break. Welcome back to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. We're now returning to our discussion on the British vaccine rollout. So far, over 4 million people have received a first dose of the jab. Concerns were raised, however, when there were suggestions that new variants first discovered in South Africa and Brazil may not be protected by vaccines that had passed clinical trials. For more on this, I'm now being joined by immunology expert from the Open University, Professor David Mail. Professor David Mail, thank you so much for joining me on Channel's Business Global. It's been a big week politically. Of course, we've got a new president in the US, but COVID-19 will still dominate headlines. And we have had a latest study suggesting that the Pfizer jab can overcome a number of genetic changes present within the virus. And we know that new mutations have really worried people, which is why we've had some of these travel bans in Brazil and South Africa. Is this welcoming news?
We've got a pretty good idea that the vaccines and the current infections that have happened will give immunity against, obviously, the current variant of coronavirus, plus the variant that's arisen in the UK. It may be that they are slightly less effective against variants from South Africa and Brazil because they are different, and that's why people are being cautious about them.
Absolutely. But separately, we've also heard from a team in Israel, and they're suggesting that one dose of the Pfizer-BioNTech jab may offer less protection than had previously thought. Now, this is one of the issues why some people are so worried that Britain are deciding to delay the second boost so that they can distribute more. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a complicated question, but that particular study or the figures came out in a news conference and they weren't really properly explained, but there may be 2 or 3 reasons for their finding there. One is that they're not quite looking at the same thing. Mostly they may be looking early in the infection, at which time people are not expected, or post-vaccination when people are not really expected to be immune to the virus. Another possibility is that they are looking at the PCR test, which is very sensitive. So they're looking for transmission rather than severe disease, which is obviously much more of a concern in this country to limit the spread of serious infection and protect the health service. And the third possibility, of course, is that when you actually do immunization in a real world, you get slightly less effectiveness than when you do immunization in a very carefully controlled clinical trial. So it may be a combination of all those things. My view is that the levels that they had reported at that news conference are very surprisingly low, and I think maybe some of the explanations I've given may account for that low level. I wouldn't expect that to hold up.
But what is the scientific community's response to the British government suggesting that they would be delaying some of these second boosters, when clearly, as you said, even though a clinical trial takes place under carefully measured and controlled circumstances, this jab wasn't supposed to be for that reason or for that purpose. It wasn't supposed to be delayed. It's supposed to be given within a certain time.
It is. The reason for that is when people set up clinical trials, they go for what they think is likely to be the best bet to work best. So Pfizer will have set up their trial thinking that 3 weeks and 2 doses is likely to be best. So that's the only thing that they've got really absolutely sound data on, that they can put their hand on their heart and say, we really think this is the best. But when it comes to practical considerations, in other words, reducing community transmission and the level of severe disease, then it's a pragmatic decision. And I would say that scientists in this country and wherever there's a high incidence and prevalence of infection are let's deal with this as best we can and use the vaccines as best we can. Sometimes scientists from some other countries, perhaps where they don't have severe outbreaks, as we do at the moment, are more critical and say, actually, you really should stick with this defined 3-week period.
Professor David Mell, immunology expert at the Open University. Thank you so much for joining me on Channel's Business Global.
You're welcome.
In other developments, the British government have this week expressed fears for the country's BAME, or Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities, and the low uptake of the vaccination. There are concerns language and cultural barriers are feeding the spread of false information. A report released earlier this week said adults in minority ethnic groups were less likely to receive vaccines than those in white groups by between 10 to 20%. Well, for more on this, I'm now being joined by Sean Bailey. He's the Conservative Party's London mayoral candidate. Sean Bailey, thank you so much for once again joining me on Channel's Business Global. Over the past week, we've had some really, I would say, quite frightening statistics, actually, concerning the BAME community and the low uptake of the COVID-19 vaccine. The Vaccines Minister, Nadeem Zahawi, has said that he's really concerned about this. Do you share his concerns?
I absolutely share his concerns. Excuse me. Thank you first for having me. It's great to see you all. Of course, I share his concerns. And I saw this coming because that you, like me, will be in all the WhatsApp groups that float around in the Black community. And there was lots of negative talk about vaccines, lots of scaremongering. And now we're seeing the effects of this. So I do share his worries. And that's why I approached him very early on and said, you've got to do something special to get the Black community to inject. Because, of course, if we do not take this vaccine, we are the community that will be heavily affected by it.
It's so bizarre, isn't it? Because in so many ways, we trust the science. You know, if we have an accident or anything, you know, we go to the NHS and they're doing so well. Where do you think this misinformation is coming from? Because it's not just within the Black community. We're all in these groups. We're all seeing these signs. But why is it our own people are deciding that they just don't want it, do you think?
I think there's been a deliberate targeting of the Black community. That message has been pushed for months and months and months, and people are genuinely scared and have been sharing a thing. And look, we all know if your mum sends you a text, it's real. It came from your mum. And that's what they've done. They've got right down in our communities and scared us. But my message would be this, that anybody of colour, Black, white, Indian, anybody, please take the vaccine. Ask yourself this question. How did we get rid of polio? Mumps, rubella, all of these things, they were done through vaccines. And the Black community in particular, we have had a very, very rough time with this COVID-19. So if we don't take the vaccine, any new strain will single us out and we'll get attacked again. So it's up to us to take responsibility. And what I've really liked speaking to Black people is that we are a community that takes responsibility. This is another opportunity to show that we're willing to take responsibility for the safety of our children and our grandparents and ourselves.
Sean, thank you so much for that stark honesty there, because to be honest with you, you know, there are a lot of people that have been speaking about these anti-vaccine campaigns, and there are several that do find it quite strange that our community in particular seem to be bearing the brunt of this. Let's talk about what's happening in London before I let you go. Goodness me, we had the Tier 5 restrictions. We're in a lockdown now, the third national lockdown. People are really struggling, not just economically, but also with their mental health. How have you been keeping strong? And what are you hearing from the people who I know you're obviously still speaking to through social media?
I've been speaking to a lot of people and seeing people as well, you know, like you say, through social media. I think there's 3 messages that I'll give. People are struggling financially, and also the worry of what that looks like across the rest of the year. The mental health thing, especially with homeschooling, has been really tough. But I'm also hearing that kind, generous, resilient Londoner, particularly in the Black community. Look, my own mother, 70 years old, asthmatic, we speak to her regularly. She's keeping me sane, I'm keeping her sane. We're homeschooling. I am a terrible art teacher, but I am trying. And when did they change maths? I don't know, because I'm finding that hard as well. But the point is, we are in a tough situation as a country, in fact, as a world. Stick to the rules. Get vaccinated so we can get beyond this COVID-19. We've got to get back to work. We've got to defend people's incomes and employment. So for me, I'm happy to stick to the rules, and I'm very happy that here in London, people are trying their best. Of course, we could do better, but people are trying.
Absolutely. Sean Bailey, thank you so much for joining me on the show. Just to remind our viewers, especially those in Nigeria, Sean is actually the Conservative Party candidate for the London mayoral election. We do wish you all the best and do come back on. Hopefully you can come and join us in the studio once these restrictions are lifted, when people start getting inoculated. Thank you so much, Sean. Sadly, that's all we have time for today, but do get in touch with your comments and suggestions. I'll see you at the same time next week for more in-depth business analysis on Channel's Business Global. Goodbye.